Welcome to New American Mythos, where old stories are kindled like firelight, and we gather round to remember the tales that shaped us. Last week, we stood in Camelot's bright fountain. We heard iron ring against stone. We watched a boy become king. And we listened as Arthur yoked strength to law, binding a fellowship by vow so that power would serve righteousness, not appetite. Tonight, we stay in that same world, and we watch the light dim. Because kingdoms don't only fall to armies, they fall to misordered loves. This is the story of Tristan and Isolde, a tale that arrives with a love potion on the sea wind and leaves behind something far heavier than romance: the slow ruin of trust, the splitting of loyalty, the corrosion of courts, and the way that private desire can scorch public order. And if Arthur's story asked what kind of king should rule, Tristan's story asks a sharper question: what happened when love becomes a rival king? Because in this legend, love is not merely a feeling. It becomes a force that claims authority. It demands secrecy. It demands exceptions. It rewrites vows. It persuades good people to call bright sin fate until the lie feels inevitable. So, listen for the potion, not as a cheap plot trick, but as a mythic symbol of how desire can feel imposed, and how, even then, the human soul must choose what it will honor. Listen for loyalty splitting like timber under strain. Listen for whispered rooms where courts begin to rot. And listen, beneath the grief, for the warning that a covenant-shaped people must never forget. A kingdom is often ruined, not by hatred, but by love that will not stay in its appointed place. This is the potion and the ruin, Tristan and Isolde. In the bright years of Arthur's rising, where men still believed Camelot might teach strength to kneel to righteousness, there lived on the far western edge of Britain a lesser king whose realm faced the sea like a shield. His name was Mark of Cornwall. Cornwall was not the heart of the kingdom. It was the borderland: wind, salt, hard stone, and the long Atlantic horizon that makes a man feel small. And Mark, for all his wealth, ruled under a kind of pressure: neighbors with old grudges, barons who wanted more land than they deserved, and the ever-present fear that the world beyond the coast might someday return with steel. So Mark kept his court watchful, and he kept near to him a young kinsman, a nephew, a champion, who seemed born to carry danger away from Cornwall's door. His name was Tristan. Tristan was the kind of man that bards love: brave without being stupid, courteous without being soft, quick with a blade and quick with a smile, and loyal in a way that made others feel cleaner just by standing near him. He had the look of someone the world had tried to break and failed to finish the job. He could ride through rain that would sour other men's spirits. He could sit in a hall of proud lords and still feel like a man, not a servant. And Mark loved him. Not perfectly, few kings love without jealousy, but sincerely enough that his court assumed Tristan's future would be knotted to Cornwall's well-being. If Mark was a pillar, Tristan was the beam braced against it. And in those days, Cornwall needed its beam. For across the narrow sea, from Ireland, there came a demand wrapped in insult. A champion of Ireland, Morholt some called him, came to Cornwall's shores with a levy, tribute to be paid year by year, as if Cornwall were a field to be harvested by another man's hand. The demand was not only about coin, it was about humiliation. It was Ireland saying to them, "You are ours." King Mark's lords argued. Some urged payment, some urged war. Most urged whatever would preserve their own households first. Tristan rose, calm as a drawn sword. "Give me the right," he said, "and I will answer this challenge." So they met, champion to champion, on an island where the sea could witness. Tristan fought Morholt and struck him down, but in the struggle he was wounded, and the wound was not clean. Poison, they said, a death that does not rush, but creeps. Tristan grew pale, his strength frayed, his senses dulled like a candle starving for air. And because pride is sometimes a kind of mercy, because he did not want Mark's court to watch him die, Tristan had himself set in a small boat and pushed into the open sea, as if the tide might carry him either to healing or to the grave. He drifted, half-living, under a sky that would not answer, and the sea, which often takes, sometimes returns. It cast him up on the coast of Ireland. There he was found, strange, wounded, noble, and brought inward to a court where a king ruled and a princess walked like sunlight under a veil. Her name was Isolde. In Ireland she was called the Fair, not because poets needed decoration, but because people could not see her without feeling the weight of beauty as a real force in the world. She had an intellect that sharpened her beauty rather than hiding behind it. She could be gentle and still unyielding. When she spoke, servants listened as if she were already the queen. Tristan, concealing his name, was tended and healed. And in time, the poison loosened its grip. But a wound can heal without closing a story, for, in time, the Irish court learned who he was. Some say Isolde herself uncovered it, the sliver of Morholt's broken blade lodged in Tristan's weapon, the kind of evidence fate leaves behind like a finger pointed at sin. Anger rose. The Irish king's honor demanded payment. Morholt had been their man. Tristan should have died there, by law of vengeance. But Isolde, whether out of mercy, out of curiosity, or because Providence was already tightening the threads, interceded. She stayed the blow. She spared the man who had slain their champion, and Tristan was released and returned home. And when the dust of that moment settled, another matter arose that would bind Ireland to Cornwall with a knot that could not be untied cleanly. Mark of Cornwall, seeking peace and alliance, demanded a bride of royal blood. He demanded Isolde. So Tristan, loyal nephew, faithful champion, took on the task that no loyal man should ever be asked to do lightly. He returned to Ireland to escort the woman who would become his king's wife. It was not a dishonorable mission. It was the kind of mission that makes a kingdom. Tristan ordered gifts. He spoke with courtesy. He swore oaths in the sight of men and God. He promised to deliver Isolde safely to Cornwall and to his uncle's bed. Isolde agreed, because princesses are often bound by treaties long before they are bound by affection. And her mother, who understood that marriages made by policy can grow cold, prepared something helpful, as older women sometimes do when they fear that a marriage will fail. A love potion. Not a fairy tale trifle, but a powerful draught meant to be taken on the wedding night by Isolde and Mark, so that affection would bloom like a forced spring. In some tellings, the potion's effect lasts a lifetime. In others, it burns fiercely for a set span. 3 years is sometimes named, before its compulsion loosens. Either way, the point was the same: to bind love where duty alone might not. The potion was placed in Isolde's keeping, guarded by her handmaiden, Brangane, in many tellings, whose loyalty was meant to be a wall around the princess's honor. Then the ship set sail. Ireland fell behind them, green and wet, shrinking into the mist. The sea opened wide. The days were salt and wind and the rhythmic creak of wood under strain. And on one bright afternoon, when thirst grew sharp and the sun made the water glitter like an invitation, Tristan and Isolde asked for a drink. Brangane, distracted whether by weariness, by the press of duties, or by that mysterious blindness that seems to fall on the moment a tragedy begins, brought them the wrong cup. Tristan drank. Isolde drank. And the world changed. Not with thunder, but with a quiet inevitability, like a door closing behind you before you realize you've stepped through it. It would be easy to call what followed romance. It would be truer to call it doom. Because the potion did not make Tristan and Isolde shallow. It did not turn them into animals. It did something more terrible. It aimed the best parts of them at the wrong end. They did not fall into lust alone. They fell into a bond that felt absolute. Affection, delight, hunger, tenderness, longing, woven together so tightly that their souls began to interpret the bond as destiny. And if you've ever watched a human heart try to justify what it wants, you know how this goes. The potion did not create love. It made refusal feel impossible. Let's take our first break here. Notice that line. The potion did not create love. It made refusal feel impossible. This is the first hard mercy of the story. It refuses to let us hide behind the word fate. The potion is real in the legend, whether you hear it as literal enchantment or as mythic shorthand for desire's compulsion. But either way, the potion doesn't erase the moral landscape. It simply makes the landscape steeper. It intensifies longing until obedience feels like drowning. And this is exactly how temptation often works in ordinary life. Not with horns and thunder, just with a pressure that whispers, "This is who you are. This is what you must do. You'll die if you don't." But wisdom has always insisted that the strength of a desire does not prove its righteousness. The intensity of longing does not baptize disobedience. So this is the question that the legend lays in our hand early on. When your heart tells you something is inevitable, what will you worship? The feeling or your vow? Because the tragedy of Tristan and Isolde isn't that they fell in love. It's that they began to treat love as an authority higher than all other authority. Let's get back to the story. Tristan and Isolde looked at one another and felt something click into place, as if the world had been waiting for this pairing all along. Their laughter became too intimate. Their silences grew charged. Even their attempts at distance felt like pain. When the sun sank and the ship creaked through dark water, Isolde lay awake and heard Tristan's footsteps, and it felt as if the sound itself belonged to her. Tristan, who had crossed islands to fight for Mark's honor, found himself watching Isolde's hands, Isolde's mouth, Isolde's eyes, and thinking with a steady terror, "I am betraying my king before he has even received his bride." He tried to resist, at first, but Resistance requires more than will. It requires a vision of the good that is stronger than the immediate fire. And the potion, whether magic, fate, or metaphor, kept pouring fuel onto the flames. They began to meet in corners of the ship, speaking in half-sentences, confessing in looks, promising nothing and yet promising everything. And in those nights, the sea bore them toward Cornwall like a judge, carrying a sentence. When they arrived, the court of Cornwall celebrated. Mark received Isolde with royal display, banners, feasting, solemn vows. Isolde's beauty made the hall go still, then loud. Mark was pleased with his alliance, pleased with his prize, pleased with his own wisdom. Tristan stood nearby, face controlled, as if he were only a champion watching his king's victory. But inside, the hidden thing burned. Isolde married Mark. The wedding night came. And because the old stories are not naive, they often tell of a cruel mercy. Brangane, the maid who had caused the potion to be drunk, sometimes takes Isolde's place in the darkness that the queen's honor might be preserved. In such a telling, even the saving move becomes another thread of secrecy, another layer of concealment, another act that binds more people into the lie. Either way, the marriage bed did not cleanse the story. It complicated it. And the kingdom, newly allied, newly hopeful, began to rot in whispered rooms, because secrecy does not stay private. It seeps. Tristan and Isolde met when they could, behind curtains, in gardens, in hunting lodges, in the thin places between court duties. They learned the terrible craft of lovers who must not be seen, the quick glance, the chosen servant, the prearranged excuse, the sudden silence when footsteps approached. They told themselves stories to make it bearable. It was the potion, they would say, an excuse with teeth because it held some truth. It is fate. It is love. And love was present. That is what makes Tristan and Isolde so dangerous as a myth. Their affection is not a sneer. It is not merely lust in costume. It is sincere, and still destructive. Mark at first trusted. He was not blind, but he was hopeful. A man can be forgiven for wishing the world to be as he intends it. Yet Mark's court was full of barons whose loyalty was thin and whose envy was thick. They watched Tristan, beloved, praised, shining, and they hated him for the way his honor made their own compromises look shabby. So they began to whisper to Mark. They warned him. They hinted. They set traps of rumor and coincidence. And because Mark was a king, and because a king is never allowed to be simply a man, he could not ignore what he heard without seeming weak. Suspicion entered the hall like smoke. The barons contrived scenes, they hid in trees, they listened behind walls. They arranged meetings where Tristan and Isolde would be forced into proximity. They accused, they mocked. And again, Tristan and Isolde escaped, not always by cleverness, but by that strange mercy that seems to linger around tragedies in their early stages, as if heaven itself waits to see whether the lovers will repent before the ruin must finish its work. Mark would catch a glimpse, hear a half-sentence, see a hand withdrawn too quickly. His heart would tighten. Then he would soften again, because Mark did not want to destroy Tristan. He wanted to be wrong. But finally there came a time, after many near discoveries, when the pressure grew too great. Tristan was banished. Some versions say 10 years, others shorten it. The exact number matters less than the truth beneath it. The court could no longer bear the tension, and Mark could no longer pretend. Let's take our second break here. Tristan and Isolde told themselves it was the potion's fault, or that it was fate's fault, or that it was the unconquerable power of love. But secrecy is not safety. As the story said, it seeps into everything. And in a kingdom that is built on covenant, whispered betrayals do not stay small. Mark wished to be hopeful. He wanted to love. But this is where the story begins to harden, not with swords or confessions, but with glances and denials and lies. Language hollowed out, truth made ambiguous. Where Arthur ruled by oath, Mark's court begins to die by half-truths and rumors. The public covenant is cracking. And once speech no longer binds men's actions, the kingdom has already begun to fall. Let's return to the story. Tristan left Cornwall not as a rebel, but as a man carrying a wound that would not close. He traveled throughout Britain, sometimes to Arthur's court, sometimes beyond, sometimes fighting as a knight, sometimes wandering as a man who cannot settle because his heart is divided. He earned praise, he won tournaments, he performed the virtues of chivalry with such brilliance that it seemed the world itself wanted to reward him. But no reward can replace what a disordered love has enthroned in the soul. Meanwhile, Isolde remained in Mark's house, queen in public, captive in private. And Mark, torn between justice and pity, sometimes softened toward her, and sometimes hardened. He was not a monster. That's part of the tragedy. He loved Isolde in the way a man can love what he has been told is his. He loved Tristan in the way a man can love his own youth and strength reflected in another. Yet the court had been poisoned. Trust does not regrow easily once torn up. At last, the story turned toward wilderness, as so many old tragedies do, when the walls of court grow too heavy and the soul has nowhere else to flee. Tristan came for Isolde, and they fled into the woods. They lived there, ragged, hungry, sleeping beneath branches, building a small shelter like a poor man's imitation of a home. For a time, they made a world of two. They hunted, whispered, and tried to turn exile into sanctuary. This is the moment that tempts modern listeners to cheer. See, we say, they chose each other. They escaped the rules. They made a little kingdom of love. But the myth refuses to let the forest become Eden, because the forest is not a sacrament. It cannot sanctify sin by becoming picturesque. In some tellings, this is the point when the potion's compulsion began to weaken, and when it loosened, Tristan and Isolde, suddenly seen more clearly, began to feel the weight of what they had done. But they remain bound, not by magic anymore, but by choice, by habit, and by the deep scar that misordered love always leaves. They sought counsel. A hermit lived nearby, an anchorite, alone in the woods, a man who had buried the world in order to better hear God. They came to him. They confessed, or mostly did. They spoke of love and shame and longing. They spoke of the potion. The hermit listened, and when he answered, he did not flatter them. He told them what vows are for, that a vow is not a feeling. It is a wall built to guard a future you cannot yet see. He urged repentance. He urged return. He urged separation. And in that clearing in the forest, they agreed. Tristan would go. Isolde would return to Mark. They parted, not in rage, but in sorrow, not as lovers clinging to sin, but as people who had finally seen it. And as they left, the forest grew quiet behind them. And here the story keeps moving. Tristan left the forest and rode north, seeking a way to live with the wound he had chosen. For a time again he served as a knight in Brittany, where his deeds brought him honor. There, a grateful king offered him marriage to a noble daughter, gentle, gracious, and bearing an uncanny name. She also was Isolde. Not Isolde the Fair of Ireland, but Isolde of the White Hands. The old songs do not say that he loved her, only that he accepted, perhaps from weariness, perhaps from duty, perhaps from the haunting hope that a different Isolde might bring a different ending. But the past does not loosen its grip so easily. Whatever vows were spoken that day, their marriage was never whole. And in time, when Tristan was wounded by a poisoned spear, it was not to Brittany's halls that his heart turned, but to the sea, to Cornwall, and to the first Isolde, still burning in his memory like a star that had not faded. And from the poison, Tristan fell ill in Brittany. Fevered and weakening, he lay in bed and sent a message across the sea. If Isolde of Cornwall still loved him, if she could come, she must leave immediately, departing under white sails. If she refused, she was to let the ship return with a messenger with black sails. The messenger departed for Cornwall, and Tristan waited. Days passed. He watched the door as if salvation might walk through it. He whispered her name in his fevered sleep. He listened for calls of white sails in the silence. But in his house was another Isolde, Isolde of the White Hands, his lawful wife, his second bond. She saw how he watched for her, and she hated it. And she saw when a ship came in. And she went to Tristan, and he asked her what color flew from the mast. Black, she said. Tristan turned to face the wall in bitterness and pain, and he died. But the ship that reached the shore did not arrive under black sails. It arrived under white, and Isolde the Fair ran from the ship, ran to him, but it was too late. She knelt beside his body. She called his name. She gathered him in her arms. And as though the potion had one last strand, her grief overwhelmed her, and she died. News reached Cornwall. Mark learned what had happened, and in some tellings he was furious, in others simply broken. But often he was both. He had lost his wife. He had lost his nephew. He had lost the shape of his court. He had lost the chance for the story to end clean. Mark ordered them buried. Some say together, others say near, but always within reach of each other, as if even a king, bound to law, must finally bow to the stubbornness of human grief. And then the tale gives its last image. From Tristan's grave, a briar grew, thorned, living, persistent. It stretched across the chapel, rooted itself in Isolde's tomb, and climbed upwards. The branches twined. The king ordered it cut back, once, twice, 3 times, but always it returned. A pagan image, perhaps, nature sealing a fate, but also a warning. Some knots, once tied, cannot be undone without tearing the cloth. And that is why this story belongs beside Arthur, because not all kingdoms are ruined by invaders at the gate. Some are hollowed from within by vows treated as soft clay, by secrecy that rots the walls, by passion crowned king and duty made servant. Camelot and Arthur's kingdom did not fall in a day. It cracked in whispered rooms like marks. Tristan and Isolde did not end as villains in the simple sense. They are a tragedy in human shape. Love mingled with disobedience, loyalty turned against itself, fate claimed as excuse, and then surpassed by choice. This is not an anthem for adultery. It is a lament for what becomes of a people who confuse intensity for innocence. Because the potion, whether spell or symbol, does not cancel responsibility. It tests it. And what falls is not just a man or a marriage. It is a house, a court, a kingdom. The hardest courage is not dragon slaying. It is fidelity in the face of 1,000 arguments against. And so the tale ends as true myths do, not with a lesson carved in stone, but with an image that stays in the soul. A ship with white sails turned black by a lie, and a vine that will not stop growing. And that is Tristan and Isolde, the potion and the ruin. So why do we close this season with this story? Well, if we're listening with American ears, we recognize the warning in our own story too. We are a people who love romance, who love the language of following the heart. But a nation cannot be sustained on feelings. A household cannot be governed by intensity. Liberty itself collapses if it isn't held inside the moral walls strong enough to withstand longing. And notice how the ruin unfolds in this tale, not through rebellion, but through signals and silence. Where Arthur ruled by open oath, Tristan's story sinks under coded glances and carefully managed appearances. What was once covenant becomes a private language of self-protection, and the kingdom cannot hold when truth becomes something only whispered, never spoken aloud. So, let this tale do what it is meant to do, not to flatter passion, but to sober it. Not to make you cynical about love, but to remind you that love must be ordered to be life-giving. Love must serve what is true. Love must honor vows. Or, if not, love becomes a fire that consumes the house it claims to cherish. Next week, we will close the season, episode 211, Anglo-Myth as a Moral Inheritance, and we will draw the thread from heroic memory to exile, from outlaw justice to covenant kingship, and we will ask what these stories have been trying to teach the American soul all along. If you want to help this show grow, share the episode with a friend, leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, and join our mailing list. The link is in the show notes below. And if you'd like to support the work directly, you can find our Patreon link there as well. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time, keep the fire burning.